All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. Thanks for coming tonight. So for those of you who I don't know, I'm Daniel Lewin. I'm the new CEO just the last year here at the Computer History Museum. Delighted to be here. We're very, very pleased to have this wonderful program this evening. As you all know, all of the support of these programs is made from our generous donors and members, and if you're not a member, we'll encourage you to take a look at the website and become a member. Also, if you're going to communicate with us online tonight, or if you'd like to go to the web, you can go to #CHM. We are really excited about this program tonight for all sorts of reasons, and I'm going to take a little more time than I typically do and make a couple of comments because of the nature of this program tonight. So joining us tonight are Eric Schmidt, Jonathan Rosenberg, Alan Eagle, all inside at Google, who were coached by and worked with Bill Campbell over the years. They will be sharing their stories and referring to their book, The $1 Trillion Coach. There are many, many things that are going to be drawn out tonight by our wonderful moderator, Susan Wojcicki, who's the CEO at YouTube and has been at Google for quite some time. Before I introduce the program, though, I want to say a little bit about Bill Campbell. Beyond having read the book, I met Bill Campbell on his first day in Silicon Valley. I worked at Apple then, and he came into my cubicle with John Scully, who had hired him. And some of you may know or not know, but I was an athlete in college, and Bill was a coach. And he wanted to know about me right away. And he asked a few questions, and it was pretty clear right then and there to me that we were going to get along for lots of reasons. And over the course of time, I did a lot of work with Bill, and it was just a wonderful experience, and I think these gentlemen captured it incredibly well in the book. But I'll also say that there was a moment in time in my business life when I was recruited away from Apple by the founder at Apple, Steve Jobs, and I left Apple and I quit the team. I quit Bill's team. And I spent some time with him thereafter the following spring after Apple had sued us and this all. And we went for a long walk. It was Easter. It was a dinner at his house with his brother and his family. I was very close with his family and his young son, Jim, at the time. And we walked around the block for a long time because he wanted me to come back to Apple. And I'd made a decision, and that was one of the things that made us friends for life, is that when you make a decision and you're confident in it and you feel right about it, you stick with it. But he tried to recruit me back. One moment in time later in my life, I was at another startup company, and Bill came in as the CEO, and he fired me. I still, to the day he died, was friends with him, appreciated everything that he did for me. I saw him on a regular rhythm, as is described in the book, and there was just nothing more interesting, very colorful as described, but a lifelong friendship with someone who really, really gave his heart and soul to this industry and to people, and brought with him the kind of guidance that is extraordinarily well described in this book and backed up by some good science as well. So I wanted to offer that as just a personal comment because from the standpoint of the people that Bill touched, you've read the stories, and I just wanted to tell you mine because I've got the stage. All right, so with that, I want to introduce 5 things about Bill Campbell, which is what we like to do when we do these programs. So here are 5 things about Bill. The trillions of dollars and market value that he helped create, again, well documented in the book. He served on Apple's board for 17 years, became the Intuit CEO in 1994. It was all Ivy football, and I'm just one of the countless many that he helped and coached along the way. So with that, let me ask the authors and Susan to come to the stage. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks. Perfect.
What is wrong with you?
I get to sit next to Susan.
I want to sit next to Susan.
You sit here. I'm
All right.
What is this?
Jonathan
sitting
here.
next to Susan.
All right, thank you. Jonathan, you can sit here.
Thank you.
Eric there, Alan there.
They had us practice this beforehand so there wouldn't be any awkward moments on stage.
Okay, well, for those of you who don't know, Jonathan was my manager for 10 years. Eric was the manager's manager. And Alan, I've also worked with for many, many years. So this is going to be really fun. Tables are going to be turned. I get to ask them lots of questions, starting with telling them where to sit. You sit here. So let's get started. Okay. So I'd like to know a little bit more about the man behind the book of $1 Trillion Coach. Can you tell us a little bit about who was Bill Campbell and why did you decide to name the book $1 Trillion Coach?
He generated probably $2 trillion of value as coach. He's the most successful coach in the history of the world. Think about it.
All right.
Alan, describe a little bit about Bill.
Well, he started as a football coach. He was on the only Columbia Ivy League championship team, and he was the captain of the team. And then he went into football coaching. He coached at Boston College and then at Columbia, head coach at Columbia in the late 70s. If anybody remembers their college football history, the Columbia football team was not very good. So maybe he was the greatest coach in history, but perhaps not football coach. Went into business at age 39, came west to join Apple in 1983.
And did something interesting in Apple III. For the folks here, this is the History Museum, 1984.
Yeah. So, go ahead. We're all looking at each other like we haven't rehearsed this before.
We haven't rehearsed. Alan, we didn't rehearse any of this.
Well, that's right. It's all impromptu. So
okay,
one of the
so
decisions.
it's
So
That's
1984.
It's the
very
Super Bowl ad.
impromptu.
It's the
Don't
Super
worry.
Bowl ad.
I'm going to take the cards and throw them, and they'll be in a different order. And everything will be completely impromptu, so don't worry about
Okay.
any of that.
Can I still talk about the Super Bowl ad?
Go ahead.
Yes, tell
Okay.
us about the Super Bowl ad. Tell us what he did.
So Bill came west to join Apple and led the launch of the Macintosh. And they launched the Macintosh with an ad at the Super Bowl in 1984. And the ad was the 1984 ad. And it was a really cool ad, and they shot the ad, and Bill loved it, and Steve loved it, and the Apple board hated it. And so the Apple board said, don't run the ad, sell that spot. And Bill was able to sell the spot, but decided not to, and decided to run the ad with the quote was, "Fuck it, let's run it."
You're not supposed to say that on stage.
Oh, sorry.
Curse word.
This one
run
is
it.
live streamed, Alan. The ones in the Google offices are just confidential.
Leave it, let's run it.
All right.
In any case, one of the most famous ads ever run on television was done by Bill Campbell as the vice president of marketing. So the question is, how did he go from there to becoming a coach? And at some point, he decided to give back.
So he gave back, but the reason we're also all here, I mean, he did amazing work as an executive, as a leader in marketing and coach, but he also had a very unique style of being a coach. I think the reason we're all here today and he touched so many people's lives is because of this really unique style. And so I thought it might be just good to hear from you, like, what was it? Like, what was the essence of his leadership style, and why, like, when we all think about Bill, like, and I was very fortunate to be able to spend time with him too, like, you know, why do people literally tear up and start thinking, saying, like, this was, you know, one of my best friends, like, he was so meaningful to me, he changed my career.
For you, Susan, you worked with him very closely. How did he make you feel?
Well, this is supposed to be me interviewing you, just to like put this, but I'll answer the question. I mean, I felt like what was amazing about Bill, and you talk about this book, is that he actually really cared about you as a person. And I have like a lot of examples of where he went above and beyond what was needed to make sure that I was having like the right doors opened for me, that I was like, you know, there in the rooms when I needed to be, and that I had a good shot, and that at my career. And he cared so deeply and went above and beyond and cared about me as a person, that like when he passed away, like we all felt like we had lost a best friend. And that, to me, what was so unique about Bill was his ability to really touch us as people.
These guys aren't following their talking points, what they were supposed to say.
Yeah, I told you that
it's
you're
about
not going to.
loyalty, it's about having your back, it's about being an evangelist for courage, it's about being generous all the time and doing positive things for people. It's about lighting up the room, whether it's, you know, his swearing or his hugging or his making everything fun. And it's about love. It's about building communities. And anything else? Anything I left out?
Okay, Jonathan, I would.
That was content. You guys were.
Okay, wait. I'm going to ask the questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jonathan. Okay, so Jonathan, tell me when you first met Bill.
Oh. Okay.
And
Tell the truth.
tell the truth.
Okay. So it
And
was a
tell
long
me
time
what he
ago.
did
I'm,
for
I'm
you.
telling the truth.
Okay, yes, it was a
It
long
was
time
back-
ago.
It was a long time ago. I was already a big shot, and you were not yet a CEO.
Yes, that's true.
And I was senior VP at Excite at Home, and Google was going to make me a job offer. It was right after Eric Schmidt started, and I was coming to collect it. And I kind of thought it was like my preordained right, because you guys were a little company, and I was already an SVP. And I turned the company down a couple of times prior.
Yes. Big
Those were
mistake.
errors. Yes.
Number
Thank you.
one. Big
But
mistake. number
Eric,
two,
now we
Jonathan.
had Eric there, and he was going to hire me.
Okay, this is your third shot.
My third shot, and I come in to collect my job offer. And Pam Shore, Eric's assistant, has a plan with Eric that they've hatched. They're going to make sure I actually accept the job because Salar Kamangar, our good friend, had just figured out, you know, price times click-through rate equal AdWords, and money flows in. So Eric had Pietro Dova show me the financials. And at the time, people hadn't seen Google's financials, and I was like, oh, wow. And I start
It's a real
salivating.
company.
You're a real company. I'm ready to accept this job. So I'm sitting in the end of this big room in the initial building and waiting for Eric to come in and waiting to sign. But first I'm going to negotiate with this guy because I'm a better negotiator than he is. And he doesn't show up. Instead, can you be me?
Sure.
Okay, you're all alone
Not
in the
really.
conference
I don't know
room.
if I can be you, but
This guy comes in. Rosenberg asked around about you. Jermalik says you're smart. Dor says you work hard. Don't give a shit. I got a question. Are you coachable?
good question.
Depends on the quality of the coach. And he like hits me. Like he gets in my space and hits me. I didn't really hit you, okay. And he walks away. And he's out in the micro kitchen and I'm sitting there in the chair. And I'm like, what just happened? Who was that guy? And then I remember that Eric has this management coach. And he's this guy that also coaches Steve Jobs. And like, oh shit, that was him? And my Google offer is in the micro kitchen. So I go running out. Mr. Campbell, sir. Mr. Campbell, sir, please come back in. Let's try that again. I'm so sorry, Mr. Campbell, sir. I'm so sorry. He's like, Rosenberg, back in the room, butt in chair. So I go back in the room, and he comes in. He makes me wait like 5 minutes. I'm really uncomfortable. I'm panicking. He comes back in, and he just starts talking. And he's delivering a lecture. I'm in Bill Campbell's woodshed getting a lecture on humility versus arrogance. And it just goes on. And then finally, he leans in. Got another question. If I were to be your coach, what would you want to get out of it? I mean, I was a pretty arrogant guy. I didn't need no coach.
Well, you did.
But at this moment, I only did one thing in my life, and it was a good answer. So I said, you know, I'd watched this program over the weekend about Tom Landry, the coach of the Dallas Cowboys. And he said, a coach is someone who sees the things you don't want to see and hears the things you don't want to hear to help you become the person you always wanted to be. How's that, Bill? And Bill saw right through me. But he's like, all right, Rosenberg, I can coach you. And I spent the next, 10 years, every other week on Bill Campbell's couch.
Can I add a little color to that color?
Oh, you want more color? Sure. Eric's the color
We
guy.
need more color.
That wasn't colorful.
So, Jonathan, of course, had turned us down twice, and we were really fortunate to have him start. So who were his first 3 direct reports?
Yes.
Salar Kamangar, Marissa Mayer,
Yes.
and Susan Wojcicki.
Yep.
Yeah.
From that little foursome came an enormous empire of talent and success, and a lot of that credit, actually, I have to say, goes to Jonathan.
Aw, that's the nicest thing you've said all week.
I have no
And
intention
Bill.
of repeating it.
And Bill.
And Jonathan and Susan and Marissa and Salar figured this out. And Susan, as an aside, do you remember your first desk with Salar attached to it?
Vaguely, yes.
So she had a desk that was about this big, and she had a chair, and there was another person right here on the corner of the desk, and he had about 18 inches, and it was Salar. And he had perfected typing on his computer on his lap because there was no space for his computer. And I thought, and of course they worked very closely as a team, and I thought this is the ultimate way to run a company. No physical space at all. And it worked.
I remember that. We shared one desk. He sat on one side, I sat on the other side, and it was very, very, very tight. And we sat with all the engineers in the room together, and it was very...
But what's interesting is that this combination, to be serious for a second, really did pioneer together the ad system, the way our ad system works. It's a $100+ billion event today, as well as the APM program, the way we do hiring. And that little group, that little foursome, right, sitting there in that one little desk, created the leaders of most of the interesting startups in the Bay Area, as well as virtually all of the vice presidents now running products at Google, came through that little four.
Well, one day we interviewed and hired this Sundar guy. He did okay.
Yeah, he did okay. Yeah, Sundar. Well, so all of us, let's get back to Bill. So all of us were coached by Bill. And Bill was a coach, okay? And what I find really amazing about Bill is he had come from football, like you talked about. He was actually, I remember him saying, like, I can't write a line of code. But yet he was considered invaluable to Steve Jobs, to Larry Page, to like all of those people that you just talked about as being, some of the early people at Google that grew it, and all of you, all of us on the stage. So what was it? Like, why was it that somebody could come here who has no expertise in technology and be a coach to literally like some of the key people in Silicon Valley?
Well, I guess I'll start. So he was all about teaching you to be a leader, but teaching you to do it by example. And, he would often say, your title makes you a manager, but it's your people that make you a leader. And he had formulas for all of the things that he did with respect to making you a leader. He taught you how to do one-on-ones. He taught you how to run your staff meeting. He'd teach you one-on-ones were about performance against the job and relationships with your peers and how you're doing to innovate and your management practices. And you got to show all your people that you know and understand that so that they'll elect you captain of the team. And once he saw that you were doing those basics right, then he helped you build trust with your people. He helped you show that you had their back. And he helped you develop deeper relationships with them. And he then helped you figure out how, whenever there was a problem, you didn't get all the smartest people in the room to run at the problem and say, well, I know the answer because everybody's got a high IQ and we all know how to solve these things. He would immediately say, focus on the team and then focus on the problem. And then he engaged with us and built these relationships and built a sense of community. And he never made recommendations about strategy or products.
But one of the things that really we learned through the process of writing the book, we interviewed 80+ people, and we started off thinking of Bill as an executive coach, and executive coaching is seen as a one-on-one thing. I coach Eric or I coach Jonathan. And what emerged through this was that he was actually a team coach, and that came out of his football background. He didn't just coach Eric, but he coached everyone's on Eric's staff. He didn't just coach Jonathan. He coached people on Jonathan's staff. And what he was doing was working behind the scenes to get the team to come together as a community. And that's a key insight. That's a key difference than when we started the book, we thought of him as an executive coach. What emerged was he was a team coach.
And in fact, in the 15 years that I met with Bill every week, it never occurred to me that he was coaching the whole team. He was coaching me. That's how personal the relationship was. And yet in practice, what would happen is I'd say, Joe Schmo over here is a little bit off the reservation, and Bill, can you go fix it? And Bill would go, and he would work with that person because he had built trust to bring them back to the goals of the firm. And he was very careful that if he thought somebody was uncoachable, and this Jonathan story is very real, then he wouldn't work with you. But if he thought that you were just what we call an aberrant genius, somebody who's just super smart and kind of slightly off, right, which is fairly prevalent in Silicon Valley, he could sit there and he could get that person to believe that they need the team to be successful and that they need to be in alignment with the team. Now, that technique is more subtle than it appeared. I'll tell you a story. One day he comes in and he says, "You are the best CEO at making decisions after a debate I've ever worked with." And of course, my chest pumps up and my ego gets inflated and I think I'm wonderful. And then a week later when I screw up, right, which is a common occurrence, he doesn't say, "You idiot, you screwed up," which is what a manager would say. He said, "You didn't achieve what your goal was," referring to the fact that I was supposed to be the best in the world. Now notice the technique. He set an expectation in my own mind about myself, and when I inevitably failed it, I was then very motivated to fix it. That's coaching. And it wasn't until we sat down and did the research that's in the book to understand that what I'm describing and what Jonathan and Ellen have so capably described, and Susan experienced as a key member of the team, is in fact a Silicon Valley invention on par with all of the other things here at the museum. That the concept of having a coach for the business team is in fact something invented here. And indeed, to give you a bit of the history of this room, we had a whole event for Bill Campbell around Bill Campbell appreciation one day. And we filled the room under the same principles. So it really occurred here. And I believe very strongly that all of us, you all, and everybody in the Valley needs to popularize this notion. It produced extraordinary value and great human value.
The idea doesn't belong in a museum, Eric. That's the past. It belongs in a book where people are going to learn these techniques and invent the future.
Or in a SlideShare, which is the modern version.
Well,
we do.
So team first. So I totally agree. Sorry, I'm just the moderator, so I need to remind them of this. Team first was definitely like a key takeaway that I saw, that he really had very little tolerance for people who were not team players, right? If he saw you were not focused on the team, then he actually believed no matter how talented you were, that you were not going to add value to this team. And it was better, like, that everybody had to be on the same team. And I just, like, wrote down a quote as I was preparing for this. She said, Bill's guiding principle was that the team is paramount, and the most important thing he looked for and expected was a team-first attitude.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I feel like this came from football, or it came from his, like, coaching a sports team.
So if you go back to Jonathan's narrative earlier, you start with the basics, then you figure out everybody's positions, then you figure out everybody's strategy, and you deal with the aberrant problems, the crazy problems. And that was his build. And he did it systematically. And what we now know, based on our research, is that everything was calculated, right? He had a formula for management. He had a way in which that he built these relationships. And it was systematic to the point where when we went to his funeral, he had 1,000 best friends. It's an extraordinary achievement, right? And I mean, think about if you could have that kind of impact on the people around you. It's a tremendous gift.
It was really kind of the John Wooden wisdom. It's amazing how much you can get done when nobody wants to focus on taking the credit. And he had these ways of figuring out if you weren't a team player. And it was, as you said, when you didn't put the team first, but it was also the people that really wanted the limelight, the people that wanted the credit, the people that were dishonest. You know, if someone reveals them, when someone reveals themselves to you, believe them, right? He had these rules, and he would make quick decisions. And if you were an aberrant genius and building the kind of products that somebody like Steve Jobs could build, or some of the people who worked for us could build, he would tolerate a lot. But he wouldn't tolerate it if you lied, he wouldn't tolerate it if you didn't have integrity, and he wouldn't tolerate it if you insisted on taking all the credit.
And interesting, when Bill started with us and with me, I said, well, what do we pay you? And he said, nothing. And I said, nothing? And what about stock options? No. I said, don't you want something? He said, no. And I said, like, what's wrong with you? I mean, like, literally, what's wrong with you? And he goes, I've been hugely successful with all of my work here in the Valley, and I want to give back. And I want to give back at a huge scale. And he, at the time, was coaching many other companies. He was on the Apple board. He was heavily involved with all of the issues inside of Apple, which we can talk about. And over again, his commitment was to pay back. It's very hard to argue with the motives of someone who refuses to get on the board and refuses to be compensated and comes in with a heart of gold to try to make the team better.
Okay, so I want to move to another chapter in your book. Okay, you call it The Power of Love, which I think is really interesting when you think about a business book, particularly a business book about tech. You wouldn't think that there would be a chapter in it called The Power of Love. You wrote, he treated everyone as a person, professional, personal, family, emotions, all of the components wrapped into one. And if you were one of his people, he cared about you fiercely and genuinely. So I want to know if each of you can tell me about something personal that he did for you to show that he cared.
Well, that word love, that's what surprised me the most about the whole process of writing the book is pretty much everybody we talked about love, how much they loved Bill, and how much Bill loved them. And, you know, one of the first times I met Bill, Jonathan and I went over to his house in Palo Alto one night to talk to him about our first book, How Google Works. And we spent about an hour and a half talking about the book. And I walked in when I first got there, and Bill said, would you like some wine? And I noticed that Jonathan had a glass of wine. Now, Jonathan doesn't drink. But Jonathan looked at this like, Alan, you want this wine. So I had the glass of wine, and I enjoyed it. We had a great conversation. And then the next morning, Jonathan texted me, hey, come over to my office. So I come over there, and Bill had given Jonathan a bottle of wine to give to me because he had noticed how much I enjoyed the wine. Now, I didn't know Bill very well, and it was a very nice bottle of wine. And this was a simple act of generosity. And, you know, there's so many ways you can show love for people, and that's one of them. Be generous with small things or big things.
Well, I'll give you two quick stories. I'll give one quick story and then a story that isn't in the book. Well, he saved my job, which was after the first 11 months before I hit the cliff vesting, and I was trying to hire and build a team because he would say you can't do anything without a team. So I was out going to business schools looking for people that would be successful product managers like me. Mm-hmm. And Larry rejected all of them, even though some of them were very smart. You remember that?
Yes, I went through this with you.
And our good friend Marissa came up with the idea of hiring APMs.
Yes.
And I was on Bill Campbell's couch when she proposed it, and I thought it was ridiculous because she said, well, Jonathan, Larry doesn't like people like you. He likes people like me. And I wanted to kill her. And then she explained her vision for the APM program, and Bill said, well, why don't you try that? So number one, he saved my job before my first year cliff vesting. But another story that isn't in the book that I think really just gives you the sense of Bill as a man. Bill asked me maybe 2007, 2008 to come give a talk with him in Monterey. He didn't usually give a lot of talks. And the talk was like on a Wednesday morning or something, and it was on my calendar for 10 o'clock. 11 o'clock the night before, I get a call from Debbie Brookfield, his assistant. Bill will be at your house at 7 a.m. Be ready. So, doesn't make any sense. The conference isn't until 10. 7 a.m., Bill comes up the stairs, knocks on the door, yells up, Beryl, Hannah, Josh, thanks for letting me borrow your dad for the day. Takes me downstairs. We drive, not to the conference, but to the Monterey Aquarium. And it's 8 a.m., and I'm like, Bill, the aquarium's closed. He says, no, there's a special door around the back. We go around the back, and we go to the door opens. They're waiting for Bill. And there was a shark, a great white shark in the big tank. And we went up there, and we go stand and look at the shark. He literally puts his arm around me, and we just stand there for 10 minutes looking at the shark. And then he says, now let's go to the conference. So we go and we give the talk. We give the talk. And he tells me he says to everybody how great I am, and all my chest puffs up and all that sort of thing like he did with Eric. And then on the way back, we go up 17, and the driver pulls over at the summit of 17 where there's that pavement and you can see the Pacific out the corner. He says, I know your family comes over to the beach a lot. They're going to let the shark out in 3 days. Whenever you drive over here, I want you to think about the moment we shared looking at the shark. We can get back in the car now. And it was like, I wasn't one of his drinking buddies at the Old Pro. I wasn't on his trip to the Super Bowls. I didn't go to the World Series games. But he just decided one day he was going to manufacture this moment that we would remember forever. And then a couple years later, he'd say something about it. I mean, who does that? That was a good story. Why didn't you put it in the book, Alan?
That was a good story.
It'll be in the paperback, Jonathan.
That was it. There's always paperback. All right, Eric.
lots of stories about Bill, but for me, I think an important one was that in the course of getting ready for the IPO, and this is in the book, there was a complex political agreement that involved me not being chairman, and my feelings were hurt. And being a prideful and arrogant person, I said, no problem. I have lots of choices. I'm just going to quit. So I call it, and this obviously would have been a total disaster. So I call up Bill and I tell him this, and he listens to me. And then, Susan, I don't think you even knew this story. And he listens to me for a while, and he says, I need to talk to you. And he comes and visits me some number of hours later, sensing my upsetness. And he convinces me that he'll fix it. And by the way, he doesn't tell me how he's going to fix it. But by this point, my trust in him is so high that I know he will fix it. And so I did literally nothing. And by the way, 6 months later, I was re-chairmanized. Right. So it shows you at a critical point where I would have done something really, really stupid. He made sure the team stayed together in a tight spot. We were in a tight spot. Lots of issues among the board and so forth and so on. We got through it, and of course the rest is history. That's a coach.
Yeah, he was definitely a coach. So I have my own story too.
Oh,
that
yeah. Susan, what was your story?
That was not in the book. Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for asking me. The good news now is, like, I don't need you to ask me because I'm the moderator. So I get to just, like, say it.
Wait a minute, I was your boss, and now you're the CEO.
Yes. So it's clear.
Are we going to let her get away with this?
Yes, we
Yes,
are, Jonathan,
yes.
because she's done really well.
Yeah, and I'm the moderator.
Thanks to your tutelage.
Yes.
Furthermore,
And-
the two of you have been talking to each other like this for 20 years.
Well, so let me tell you the story. So we had this, I've been at Google for 20 years, and Google's had various different review and performance review cycles, some of which have been better than others. But anyway, and I'm not talking about my personal review, just the process of the review. So we had
never got a bad review.
We had one review process that, I don't think you actually know about this story. We had one review process that was not very well done, and it was not delivered to me by someone who was, like, very knowledgeable about my work. And I was really upset about it. And I didn't say I was going to quit, but I was like, hey, like, do you not value me? Does the company not value me? Is this, like, the feedback that I'm really getting? And so I sent an email to Bill and to a few other executives that I was really upset about this process and the feedback I had been given. And I was leaving the next day on vacation, so I was just like, I'm gonna like go on vacation and never speak to those people again. And like when I come back, like that's gonna be it. And then Bill said like, I need to speak to you. And he, put his cell phone number, and I didn't call him back. And then been like another hour, 2 hours later, I really need to speak to you, Susan. I was like so angry. I'm like, I'm not calling him back. But then at like 11 o'clock at night at home, my phone rang, and it was Bill, and he was just like, I need to talk to you about the review, and I'm like really mad about the way it was done, and I'm gonna fix it, and I'm gonna do all these different things. And he's like, you don't worry about it. You go to Hawaii, you hug your babies, and like I'm gonna have everything taken care of when you come back. And I was just like, okay, exactly. Problem solved. I'll go to Hawaii and hug the babies, and but it really took the edge off of it for me,
But think
he solved it for me.
Think about how fundamentally important that is. Because today in the Valley, these companies and these management teams are under enormous stress. They have so much less time in front of them than we did collectively. Look at the rate of stuff that Susan deals with literally every minute in running YouTube. Yeah. It's an enormous pressure cooker. You need a coach to help you get those people through it.
But I think the good thing about the book, and the reason why I recommend it, is like even for everyone who's just a manager, like here are some lessons we've already talked about, right? Like the value of a team, the value of trying to get all of the people that you're working to work together, and that greater team is more important than any individual. And then the value of caring about your employees, not just as like what they're doing when they come into the office, but what's happening above and beyond, and creating moments that show that you really care about the person.
Yeah, that's really one of the things we talked about during the book was, wait a minute, are we just writing a book about Bill and no one else could do this? And really our belief is that these things that we talk about, really anyone can do. A manager can do them.
Right.
A manager can be the coach as well.
Right, so I think these, I think there are lessons here that can really apply to everyone. And I know, actually, I was lucky because I think one of his last meetings at Google was with us, where he was talking about how do you systemize the leadership, and how do you actually make it so everyone can take advantage? And like when you talk about his principles, like they aren't complicated, like they are replicable, but yet so many people don't do them. And so I want to move to one other of his points, which was he always talked about getting the one-on-one right. That was like, if you had 5 points about Bill, it would be like, care about your people, think about the team, get the one-on-one right. So he had one-on-ones with both of you regularly, and with Alan too. Like, tell me like a little bit, like how did the one-on-ones work, and like what does it mean to get the one-on-one right?
Sure. So, Reed, you have different perspectives on this. My one-on-ones would start with Mike coming to Bill's office, and he would ask me what I wanted to talk about, and generally he would encourage me to keep it to like 4 or 5 things. So the one-on-one would start, and I'd give him my 4 or 5 things. He'd look at his list that was in his pocket, think about what I said. If they matched, Jonathan had his priorities straight that day. If they didn't, he'd tell me what my priorities needed to be. And what did we learn during the book?
So we're talking about the one-on-one section of the book, and Jonathan comes in and says, this is how he did one-on-ones. And Eric said, that's not how he did one-on-ones. You'd walk into the room, and there'd be these 5 words on a whiteboard. So what we figured out was the prioritization exercise that Bill went through with Jonathan, Eric didn't need.
But I did learn very carefully what you do, and literally it was a formula. He'd really want to know performance against what we called at Google your OKRs, your objectives and key results. How are you doing specifically against those things? Most managers just focus on those things. The next thing, though, was how are you doing with your peers? Are you and Shona getting along? Are you and Omid getting along? Are you and Alan Eustace getting along? Very few people actually focus on that. And he'd also always leave time, because he so strongly believed, he would say that the problem with marketing is it forgot that its first name is product. So he wanted to make sure that you were doing things to ensure that you were innovating. And then he'd want to know, how were your management practices? Were you practicing what he would call the rule of 7, right? Were you making sure as your organization grew and evolved, you didn't have a hierarchy where any manager had 1 or 2 people working for them. You had spans of control that were 6 or 7. So everything, he had a rule, and he wanted to check that you were adhering to that rule, and if you weren't, he'd let you know.
I sort of think of it as an equation. To be a great leader, you have to first be a great manager, get the details right, like the one-on-one, and then also be a great coach. They go together.
So the other quote that you talk about in the book is, he said, "I hate consensus." And I used to hear him talk about, like, be a decision maker. It actually doesn't matter what your decision is, but make the decision. And, maybe you can tell me a little bit, like, how you saw this play out. And again, like, there's another lesson for people as they just think about management style, like, making that decision. How did he advise you on those points?
So one of the things that he taught was that it was very important to get to the right decision, not the consensus decision. And this context, up until that point in the industry, there was this trend for essentially consensus management, getting everyone to agree. He thought that was a terrible idea. So the way we evolved and the way we would run staff meetings, which he was very proud of, and he came to my staff meetings and didn't say a word, but he was obviously watching, and then of course would brief me later, is the first thing would happen, of course, is all the people who normally talk a lot would talk a lot. Okay, so you have to let them talk.
I did that.
Yes. And then eventually, when Jonathan was finished talking, there were others, and the procedure was I would call on them. And if someone would start interrupting them, I would say, let him or her finish. And then at that point, we would say to ourselves, who has the best idea and who has the best data? And sometimes it was somebody in this room, and sometimes it was somebody elsewhere. And there were all sorts of examples of this. And then Bill would say, now that you've got all the data in the room and everyone's heard everyone's opinions, including the people who never speak, search for the best idea. And if you cannot figure out the best idea, make a decision based on what you've got then. But the goal of the management team is not to achieve consensus, but rather have an exploration of the ideas based on all the data that's in front of you. And he was very data-centric to get there. And I think that of all of the things that he taught us, the rigor of that probably had more impact on the way that the empire was run, the way the structure of the cadence of meetings and so forth than anything else, including his one-on-one rules and his kindness and all that.
You'll remember when Larry was upset with how meetings were going and he disappeared into his office and wrote a manifesto on how meetings need to be run. And it started with data. And Bill couldn't stand sort of the, that Jim Barksdale approach of if we have data, let's hear the data. But if all we have are opinions, let's use mine, right? He hated that. And he really showed us that it was often the case that it was the most junior person in the room who actually knew the data. And there were some occasions where he'd really point to that. And he'd say, you guys were all arguing. And it happened to be that there was that one person over there in the corner that you asked at the very end of the meeting. And that person spoke up. And she was the youngest person in the room, but she explained that everything that you were thinking was based on the wrong data.
I'm not sure about how other companies work, but in our company, often it was the most junior person, literally the youngest or the least experienced, if you will, person, who was the person who was the total quant on all the facts. And if you would just call on them and let them explain it, all of the people bloviating would be discovered as having made up facts compared to the actual data.
Okay, so I want to move on to just another topic because I think, and then I'm going to, I have questions from all of the audience here, so I'm going to get to those in just a minute. But
we like your questions better, don't we, Alan?
Yeah, no, we're going to get to the, again, I'm the moderator. I'm the moderator. Okay, Alan.
I think we should definitely
should go with
Alan.
She wants to ask me a question.
Alan.
You see what it's like to write a book with these guys?
Okay, Alan. You spent a lot of time, interviewed many people. Can you tell us, like when Bill talked about being a coach, what did he mean and how is that different than being a manager? And also how did he define being a leader and how is that different from being a manager? Because he said your title makes you a manager, your people make you a leader.
That's a lot of questions.
I know, that's a lot there, but I'm giving you some good runway to tell us about how he thought about being a coach, being a manager, and what were the differences there?
So being a manager, again, means getting the details right. Running a tight one-on-one, running a tight staff meeting, at times dictating decisions. Being a coach is supporting people, trusting people. I'll give you an example, cheering for people. Okay, so we got a great story from Clay Bavor, who's an executive at Google. When he was a junior product manager, or maybe a group product manager, was presenting one of his new products, it was called Expeditions, to the Google board, and he was kind of nervous. And he was kind of fumbling his way through it, and in the middle of his presentation, he hears this clapping from the back of the room. And it was Bill cheering him on. So now you think about that. What do coaches do? Sometimes they tell you what to do, but sometimes they cheer you on. So, all right, let's give an example. Who here thinks Susan is doing a great job? So think about that.
Well, no.
Should we do that again?
No, let's do the audience too.
Well,
we like this audience, right?
Who thinks the audience is doing a great job?
Okay. And then what about the authors of the book?
Well, who thinks we're doing a great job? So that's a simple technique.
Did you notice something happened aside from repetitive and useless clapping? Right? The mood went up, the energy went up, engagement went up. I don't know about you all, but I sit in these long, boring meetings. Best thing to do in the middle of a long, boring meeting is either have Jonathan tell some joke, or, if he's not available, clap. Get people up, get people excited. And Bill did this instinctively.
And this is something any of us can do. You're in a meeting and something good happens, cheer.
And so how about, is there a difference between being a coach, a manager, and a leader?
Yeah, so I guess I'll take that. I think a manager, well, I was good at the manager part. You control, you manage, you supervise, you evaluate, you review, you tell people what to do.
You don't need to hurt
Can you believe I was able to survive 10 years?
Right? That's a manager.
Okay, all right, but let's move on with the coach. We got to the coach.
Coach, support, trust, respect, evangelize for courage, have their back. and get them to be better.
And I think
Eventually, I was a good coach, Susan. Look where you ended up.
Jonathan, would you stop?
You are a very good coach.
Jonathan, you're
And
losing
there's
it.
times when you have to think about you're the manager, and there's times you have to think about you're the coach. And for myself, I make a conscious decision. Sometimes you're coaching.
And what about the leader?
That's the two together.
The two together.
Good answer.
Okay.
You see?
And so next week, I'm going to give an answer, and he's going to say, you can do better.
All right. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move to the questions here that are, okay, how should a startup founder find a coach? Like, we were all lucky. Bill somehow showed up in our office. That's the way it felt to me. I know there was John Doerr advised him to come over, and there's like a story in the book. But how should someone find a coach today?
Well, first place, we're trying to get this whole movement started. And so we want to see coaches of teams. My advice would be try to find somebody who's a little bit more experienced than you. Try to find somebody who wants to talk to the whole team. Somebody who exudes trust and empathy and actually listens. And I think you'll do pretty well.
And as a startup founder, start practicing these principles now to set the culture for your company.
They could ask you, and your sister found me.
Yes, that's true. That's true. So did Bill have a coach? And if so, who was it?
I'm not aware of Bill having a coach. I think that he was forged through the first version of Silicon Valley when he transitioned from football coach to working for Steve Jobs, which is a pretty strong annealing function. And I think he learned in that crucible.
I think he learned so much of it in sports because like when I actually heard the athletes speak about him, I saw so many parallels in terms of how he coached us. And I think the brilliance was he brought a lot of the sports coaching to business in a way that had never been brought in that way.
And put another way, think about it, if you're a football coach or a basketball coach, you're dealing with prima donnas. These are people who have very high opinions of themselves and very high expectations and often very young. Does that sound like Silicon Valley or what?
I actually think his coach was his first principles. And he would actually ask people to write them down, and he would often refer in meetings to the first principles and the cultural values that he would codify in the beginning. You know, he did this at Intuit. He had it on the wall. It was kind of his people, support, trust, respect. But he did it with the internal team at Google the first year that he started, which you helped with. And anytime there would be a problem, he would go back and say, okay, what are we about? We're about focusing on the user. We're about the set of things that we said were the principles that we hold to be self-evident. And that was like his guiding light, and he'd remind us of that when we had a problem.
Okay, this is a really interesting question here. What did he teach you about life, about marriage, about raising your children, and about being a good husband? Thank you.
Did Beryl ask that question?
Yeah. The answer would be, he would teach you to be empathetic. And, you know, I guess I can define, and I think what's so interesting about that, which Alan talked about, is it's still really hard, right? Like, it's still hard to get it. You can sit there with a counselor and they can explain to you what it means, but then to actually do it is really hard. And I think what's so fascinating about most of the principles in the book is that they're the same, many of them are the same things that you can read in lots of pop psychology manuals and other leadership books, but people don't do them. People don't stop and listen. People don't engage in active listening. People don't show.
Mention the slide.
So Eric.
Oh.
What? So Eric.
All of this is, all of these principles are freely available in a slideshow that you can find with your favorite search engine by typing $1 trillion coach SlideShare.
Okay.
So if we're going to be
we'll
classy
do that
and fix
later.
our SlideShare, we're going to do it
Okay.
because Eric makes me and
We'll
he doesn't.
do
Susan, I
that
have to
later.
answer
We'll do that later, but I want to hear from Alan and Eric about what he taught you about life, marriage, children, and being a good husband.
I think that Bill was a family-first person. And so what I learned mostly was basically start with your personal life, start with your own happiness, understand that this stuff is a marathon, right? There's this tendency to think that life is defined by these 2 or 3 year IPO cycles, and then it's sort of like nothing happens. And so because that's the wisdom of age in his case, but understanding that this is a marathon, that you have to keep your family with you, you have to get your health with you. He was sick, and most people didn't know this, virtually all the time that I worked with him. And of course, I knew the details, but he didn't tell anyone else. But nevertheless, he kept up the focus on his family and his children, his son and daughter, and his work.
And these principles that we've been talking about, trust and love, it wasn't just for Bill in business, it was for Bill in life.
Yeah.
He built community in business, but he built communities all the time. He ran an annual Super Bowl trip. It was all kind of life for him. He coached football at Sacred Heart, and we heard from several kids that he would be coaching football every Tuesday and Thursday, 4:30 to 5:30, and sometimes he'd get a call. And he'd look at his phone, he'd put it back, and the kids would notice the call was from Steve Jobs. But for that hour, he was listening to the kids. He was with the kids. So that's part of it. When you're with someone, part of how you establish trust is when you're with someone, be with them.
Is to be present, which today means not on your phone, but in fact talking to the person.
He was a really good listener.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I have learned to appreciate, like as I've gotten older, is like the value of just listening and the value of being heard and like connecting with someone that they know that you understand what they're going through and that you're actually going to do something about it or going to even just understand it. So, okay, next question. What did Bill teach you about failure? Alan.
What did Bill teach? Well, maybe that's a better question for Jonathan, but I'm just kidding.
I'll take it.
All
I'll take
three
it
of
if
you,
you want.
all
Bill?
three of you are gonna.
Okay,
I'm gonna
so
ask all three of you. All three of you have.
The most important thing Bill would look for in people is coachability, and the most important thing in coachability is how do you learn, and what's a great way to learn? Failing. So failure's not a bad thing if you learn from it, and if you get better as a result of it. But if you're arrogant and you think you know it all, and then you're totally just destroyed by failure, then you're not going to do so well around here.
We talked a lot about grit and how people respond to stress and failure is a very big indicator of how successful they're going to be. And in these competitive markets, the person you want to back is the person where when the incumbent enters the market with a much better finance product, with a big marketing flash, that manager doubles down and works harder as opposed to gives up.
Well, you learned about failure when you ended up in Bill's woodshed. And remember in my staff meeting, we had Jonathan's pit of despair that people would go into that they could never get out of. Bill's woodshed was different because you could actually get out. And when he took you there, you never forgot it. And the seminal time I remember going there was when the Tyrants of Tech article came out in 2008. And there was this article that came out in Gawker that was, here's to the screaming ones, the imperious yellers that, won't shut up until they get their way. And Steve Jobs was number 1, and Steve Ballmer, the chair thrower, was number 2, and Dave Colburn was number 3, and Mark Benioff was number 4, and you go down the list, and their number 9 was Jonathan Rosenberg. And I was really proud of myself. I think I shared that with our whole staff. And I went to my therapy session with Bill that week, and he usually was there right away, but instead Debbie Brookfield, his assistant, was there, and the only thing on the table is the article. And I'm like really happy, because that's pretty cool. We're going to talk about the article. And I come in there, and he's like, what article is this? I'm like, well, I'm number 9. He's like, Jonathan, I know Steve Jobs. I work with Steve Jobs. You're not Steve Jobs. You don't get to do this. And then he basically throws me out of his office and tells me to think about it for a while. And I'm like, Bill, I got my list. I got my 5 things. Let's compare notes. He's like, no, session's over. He then actually called Shona Brown to say, I'm really worried about Jonathan. I just took him to the woodshed. Can you check on him? And I come back 2 weeks later ready to grovel in front of him because I've failed and I'm needing to explain myself. And I get to his office and he just immediately opens the door, hugs me, and as I start telling him how sorry I am, he's like, I administered that lesson. I already know you learned that lesson. Let's talk about the 5 things on your list.
So he knew exactly what he was doing.
Exactly.
All right, this is a good question. In 25 years of working in Silicon Valley, none of my engineering managers have had any formal management training or coaching. How do we get Bill's principles to filter down to the rest of us?
Say buy the book in a really crass, pandering way, and say it in an independent bookstore. We want the independent bookstores, not just the Amazon sales. Go on.
Okay, I just want to get the script right. Please buy the book in independent bookstores so you can support
Thank you.
them. I'm concerned that the questioner is in a company or a set of companies that don't have internal management training. If your company doesn't have internal management training, why don't you work on using our book as your textbook for getting management training inside the company?
And in fact, we're doing that at Google. We pilot tested a training course for leaders at Google about coaching and these sort of principles, and we want to expand it within the company.
Who is the next Bill in the Valley?
Jonathan Rosenberg.
Oh. No. It's such an overstatement that I'm hugging you.
All right, let me ask. So we've gone through a number of different Bill values, right? Build a team, get the one-on-one right, make hard decisions for your team. So tell me, like, what are other key? Like, if Bill were here, like, what are the 2 or 3 other things that you think would be important to tell this audience? Of his
Simple
key
ways to
principles?
build teams. Simple ways to build teams. Start meetings with trip reports.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why?
Well, you were the victim of this for many years.
Yes.
So what would happen is we would start the meeting, and I'd say, kind of, where's everybody been for the last week or two? And people would inevitably have been in Europe, and there was some crisis, or in Mexico and some crisis. People would occasionally be on vacation. And it got so popular that people would say, I didn't travel at all, but I had this dinner on Saturday night, and here's what I heard. The purpose of the trip report, aside from building business intelligence, was to humanize people, right? That their lives mattered. And people would say, oh, I was stuck on United Airlines, and they treated me poorly, and everything. Oh, yeah, that happened to me, and, that kind of stuff. It started with a human tone. Another thing that he pushed very hard was try to assign problems to 2 people instead of 1. Now, nobody ever does that. Why? Especially if the 2 people don't really like each other. Working on the same problem and actually learning how to work together worked. And the bizarre thing as CEO was by then we started having big empires and lots of things going on and all this. And people would actually give people budget. So I'd say to Jonathan and, Omid or whatever, sort it out. And they would actually exchange 1,000 people organizationally without complaint, because they understood that they could work together and they were working for the interests of the team. And I had never seen that in any of the companies before, where the way you got ahead was you preserved your budget and your revenue because that's how you got promoted.
You probably don't remember this, but there was a time when Bill came and sat in on our staff meeting. And it was intentionally Monday afternoon, because Eric's staff meeting was usually Monday morning. And my plan was to take all the action items that I got in Eric's staff meeting and parse them out to the people on my staff, and then I could have an enjoyable rest of the week. And when your staff was, Susan and Marissa and Salar and Sundar, there were pretty good people to get everything done. At one point, after sitting in my staff meeting, Bill gave me this lecture about pairing things. And then I would take the most simple things. We're going to do an offsite. And I would say, well, Susan, I think you and Marissa should figure that out. Probably takes 2 people. You guys looked at me like, well, that's crazy. Either of us could figure this thing out. But what Bill felt was if you give 2 people a task, even if it's a task that's relatively easy, it creates a success for them. And then they come back, and then the next time they have something that's much more difficult. They have a foundation to build on from the original task that they did.
It's a long
So it wasn't that I didn't think you could manage the offsite. It was that I thought you needed to build a relationship.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm glad to find that out. Okay, so what else? So I agree, manage the staff meeting. He always talked about running the staff meeting, and he always started the staff meeting with the trip reports.
We haven't talked about how he managed our board. Bill famously refused to be on our board. So what would happen is I would say, Bill, there's a board meeting coming up, go brief them. And he would call them all and kind of give them a heads up because he knew what was going on, and then he would come back and give me their concerns. So by the time we showed up in the board meeting, there was never a surprise. And first rule for those of you who are planning to become CEOs, never surprise the board. Not a good thing, right? Especially if it's bad news. So it worked because when the board members showed up, they knew roughly what the issues were and they had been heard. Similarly, if I had things that were issues or other board members had issues, he served as this information out. At the end of the day, that was as important for keeping the board together among various competing interests, right, as the company grew, as the way he helped manage the management team. You need both.
And one more. You know, you asked earlier the difference between a manager and a coach. Let's say you've got a problem. A manager, and all of our tendency is, let's go solve the problem. What's going on? Let's analyze it. Let's come up with solutions. The coach's tendency is, who's the team working on the problem? So, you know, his approach was, let's first focus on the team and then get the right people working on the problem. Subtle difference.
He would also, in the love chapter, we say, love the founders. He really had an appreciation for founders in companies. He believed that they were able to do things that other people couldn't. One of the CEOs we interviewed said, you know, one day you won't be CEO and they'll still be the founders. And he really had a strong appreciation that you needed to constantly water and feed the founders and keep them engaged and help them stay successful with the people in the company.
All right, so I'm going to go back to the audience questions. What was the toughest lesson Bill taught you? I think we heard a little bit about your.
Well, I would just, I'll get a simple one on this one. It's what you learn after you know it all that counts. And I think that's what Bill did to me. He broke me down so that he could expose my flaws and make me realize that I was 41 years old and I didn't know it all, and there were things I could learn from him, mostly about people and coaching.
I think in my case, there's a conflict between deliberative management, getting people's ideas, running the process right, and getting things done. And what he would say is, if you really are upset about something, say it. So one day, I was upset about a whole bunch of things, so I really laid into everybody. And I was so mad, we just stopped. And Bill comes up to me and says, good job. You did one half, and you failed the other half. Right? You didn't do the other half. If you listen to Jonathan's story about the woodshed, Bill had both halves. He had both the feedback, but also the re-acceptance. And I had violated that principle. It's important to remember, you've got to do both with people. It's okay to show your anger. It's okay to show your upsetness, but you have to bring them with you. And that starts by listening to them, acknowledging them, all the things that I had not done in that very moment.
I think it also goes back to some of the trust principles, right? Like that you can be weaker and that you can be more exposed if you actually trust the person that you're with.
One of the things that we talk a lot about is that it's important that executives feel safe at work. If they feel that they're going to be judged inappropriately or for something they say or poorly handled, they're going to not take a risk, they're not going to speak out, they're not going to participate. So the first rule of coach/manager is to make sure each person who's sitting in the seat or what have you feels comfortable the way they're perceived, the way they're dealing with, the way people deal with them.
And what's fascinating there is that, you know, if you just look at some of the research that we've done at Google with Project Oxygen and others, all of the research says that successful teams start with safety, respect, clarity of goals. You have to have a mission that matters. You have to have meaningful roles. And you go back and listen to the things that we're talking about. That was the Bill Campbell playbook before we did any of that research.
Alan, so what was the toughest lesson Bill taught you?
Well, I wasn't coached directly by Bill. I learned a lot more through interviewing all of you, the 80-plus people we interviewed. And so it wasn't as much a tough lesson as really just an enlightening lesson about the value of love in the workplace. Again, that word came up over and over again. And, the idea of just showing, thank you.
People like that.
Yeah.
You see? And, just showing, and it's taking a few minutes to chat with people. How was the family? What'd you do this weekend? It's the simple things that, bringing humanity in the workplace. I think we have this wall that, there's home and there's work, and just breaking down that wall.
I'll give you another example. One of our internal executives told the story at an internal meeting last week about Bill. where they had done some amazing earnings when she started.
Ruth's first earnings call, and
right.
she did a great job.
And Bill came in to the person who had worked with her and said, who did the actual work? Of course, it was neither of them. It was a bunch of relatively junior staffers. And he said, call them all in. So they all show up. And he spends 5 minutes making them feel wonderful. And then he gets down to business with the more senior executives. They all talk about it. Why do I tell you this story? It only cost 5 minutes. That's the principle. That extra 5 minutes. And my advice to you all is, you have 5 minutes to go to the junior person who did all the work, that person in the corner, and say, who are you? What did you do? Wasn't that amazing? Thank you. Right? It has huge impact. Just cheer a little bit. Good answer. I'm getting some praise from Jonathan.
Okay, another audience question. What are the different levels of coaching? How does it change when you're coaching a CEO versus a director?
In the American system, the CEO is sort of all-powerful, and a lot of responsibilities on the CEO. And the boards, sort of the generic rule is the board's only actual action is the hiring and firing of the CEO. So it's going to vary. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that every player in the system has their own insecurities, their own needs, their own wants, their own problems, their own frustrations, their health problems. Indeed, for me, the reason I knew I could trust Bill is that when I first started working with him, one of our executives had a disease similar to what Bill had, and it confided into Bill, and Bill didn't tell me. And I thought, if Bill didn't tell the CEO something like that, then Bill could be trusted.
Well, I think Adam Grant did a great job in the forward of saying it. He said, as you go up the hierarchy, it gets even more important, because as you get to the top, the people have bigger egos and more ambition, and they're more arrogant, and so they require a better and more well-versed and
Get your
nuanced
hand off of me.
And this is actually something that I sort of discovered through the writing of the book, as someone who's maybe not quite as high up the hierarchy as my co-authors, is exactly what Jonathan was saying, is that, you know, even though these are very successful, powerful people and accomplished people, the ego and the ambition and all of the insecurities are still there.
You actually said it much worse. You said that you assumed that as you went up the power curve, everybody was more together, more self-actualized.
It's not true.
More together as human beings, and it's much worse as you move up.
Yeah. And one thing that Bill was really good at that we talked a lot about in the book was seeing all the players on the field. So you're sitting in a meeting. This came from coaching. You know, when he was a football coach, he could not just watch the ball, but he would see all 22 players and what they're doing. And when you're an executive coach and you're in the meeting, you're not just watching who's talking, you're watching who's reacting.
Yeah.
And it's maybe with body language. It's maybe they're not comfortable. And then you go around afterwards and you say, what was going on there? And you know, so that skill, I think it's important at any level, but it was really more important the more senior in the company you went.
So I was in the many meetings where Bill sat in, and like the interesting thing for me is that he didn't say a lot in the meetings.
Yeah, very quiet.
So I always was wondering, what was he doing there, right? But I know he spoke with you afterwards. Like I saw sort of the footprints of changes or recommendations or like ways he advised you. One of the things, like, I did see him speak up a lot in the meetings. Like, one of the few times and few topics I saw him speak up on had to do with diversity. That he was a strong advocate of diversity.
Yeah, he was.
No, we can be louder.
And so what's interesting is he seems to, in history, be one of the first executives to focus on diversity. This was a big project of his 25 years ago, in terms of coaching women and minorities into the workforce. And he taught that you can get diversity and you benefit from diversity and inclusion. It may take a little bit more time.
He was a big advocate and very helpful.
And he would get mad when people didn't get invited to things. I mean, you told a story in the book
Right.
of when you started it at YouTube and there was an event that you weren't invited
Right,
to. He was
right.
just furious.
Right. So there's a story in the book where there was an event, and I was already CEO of YouTube, but I couldn't get an invite to this event. And like, I'm a pretty persistent person, and I had already spoken to lots of people and tried lots of different ways to get to it. And anyway, I couldn't seem to get anyone to move. And then I talked to Bill and called Bill and told him like, hey, I can't get an invite to this event. And Bill like was really good at swearing. And so like a whole bunch of swear words came out. He got really mad. Was like, arr, like, I'm gonna fix this. I'm gonna like, you should be there. And then I just remember that he hung up soon after. It's quick. And then I got an invite to that event. And like he never called me and said, oh, I fixed it. He just like, it just showed up. But it was actually, for me, it was like what I learned from that event was like, I realized like, wow, like Bill has incredible power and he just used his power to get me to go to this event. And it made me realize like how transferable power is. That people in positions of power could hand it out and could open doors. He literally could open a door for me and I took it and I went. And I was so thankful and I always remember him for that. So, okay, we have only a few more minutes, but I do want to know, here's a question. How did Bill help or advise the team when there were questions about privacy, NSA, or affiliations a bit more critical? Or basically, what was Bill's advice in a crisis? Like when things were tough, like what was his advice on how to handle that?
So what was fascinating there is he really didn't engage on product and strategy issues. The extent to which you knew his opinion on those things was in those rare moments when he saw product market fit and he got excited about something like, okay, the App Store, that's going to be big, or something that, or yeah, we need to do Chrome, that seems exciting. Generally, what he would do when one of those problems came was he would stop, get us to focus on the team that we were going to assign, and then sit down with that team and go back and review first principles. I don't recall him engaging specifically on anything like what we should do about a privacy problem, or if you had a tough problem at YouTube today. I don't think he'd come in and tell you what to do. He'd come in and ask you who was working on it and why that was the right group.
But he would make sure to get the problem out on the table. We always talk about the elephants in the room. He would say, let's get it out on the table. Let's talk about the problem. Let's not ignore it. And if we have to rant and rave and get angry at each other, let's get that over with, so that we can move on to getting to the best idea.
Yeah, he also, I think, you guys tell me, but I also thought he was really good about, with some of our OKRs, of identifying early on when there were problems. Like he wanted to get that problem heard and wanted to get the team on it fast to identify a problem before it got further along and before it was too late to fix it.
Well, again, that was also just the EQ of filling the gaps in between people. He'd be looking at people's reactions, and he'd see from their reactions when he brought the elephant out in the room, and there was this, argument and session, who the person was who really understood that they were going to leave the room and not support the decision, and then he'd go fix that.
So do you guys miss Bill?
Every day.
Every day I ask myself what Bill would do.
It was a tremendous honor to write this book. We felt like we were entrusted with a really important legacy. And, it's just an honor to be able to talk to so many people and convey his, codify his principles.
Yeah. No, I definitely miss him too. Okay, well, I'm going to give you guys a minute to talk about your book. Now you can do the shameless plug that you've been trying to do. So tell people about your book and the slideshows and other places where you want them to learn more, because we're about to end, or we're at the end here. And so,
I wonder if we would have been more successful if Jonathan had worked for you. I think so.
Okay, well, Susan's tearing up now. I'm going to tear up.
I learned a lot from Jonathan.
I think that I did make one mistake, which is I should have had Susan on top and Jonathan doing.
Well, I learned so much from Jonathan, and I learned so much from Eric, and I worked along, Alan and I worked for many times, and I'm so thankful I could spend time with Bill, and he really did change our lives in so many ways. I think I wouldn't have had the job that I have today if it hadn't been for Bill.
So we started the book as a testament to our mentor and coach. We ended up, by virtue of our research, discovering this great body of knowledge, which we've now written down. But more importantly, we discovered a need, which is there is a new product that comes out of Silicon Valley, which is this concept, this set of rules, which Jonathan so ably recited in his 5 points and his 4 points and so forth and so on. He learned well from Bill. And all of you can replicate this. The secrets are not that hard, but you have to do them all.
So I think the final word should be that people can get all of this for free with the SlideShare,
said
$1 trillion coach
already said this.
SlideShare, or they can be tearing up like all of us by actually going to an independent bookstore and buying the book and reading it.
Okay. Well, so thank you so much, Alan Eagle, Eric Schmidt, Jonathan Rosenberg, and Bill, who's here with us in presence. If we can all just come away with a little more love.
Susan.
Thank you.
Susan.
No, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Is Daniel coming up?
Dan will come all up.
I think we're supposed to stay for 1 minute. He's going to say something, and then we're going to leave. Go ahead.
I just want to thank you all. They did a wonderful job, don't you think? And join me in thanking them. Thank you. Nice to see you. Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's been a wonderful evening. We appreciate your support. Thanks to the panel, and thanks to Susan. Great. You're so welcome. This is terrific. Well, I can tell you.